Welcome, dear listener. Tonight, let the fire warm your thoughts and the world soften around you. We begin in a quiet valley wrapped in fog and superstition, where the village of Eld Hollow has stood for longer than even its own records remember. It was a place where the seasons changed without urgency, where the hills whispered old names into the wind, and where tradition held more weight than truth. In Eld Hollow, girls were born with names already chosen for them. Some sweet like Rosewater, others shaped by the ancestors who were said to watch from the chapel rafters. Among these girls was Leora, born during the eclipse with hair dark as ravens and eyes too still for a child. Her mother believed she was a sign, her father a burden. The others in the village only watched, and as the years passed, the quiet child became a quiet maiden marked gently but unmistakably by the rhythm of rules carved in the very bones of the village. And in Eld Hollow, no rule was older or heavier than the purity test. The purity test was not named aloud in daylight. It was spoken in corridors and behind curtains, always accompanied by glances and fingers nervously folding cloth. No one remembered exactly how it began, only that it was custom, and custom had no beginning. On the first moon of her 17th year, every girl of age would walk alone to the chapel steps, cloaked in white, eyes lowered, hands bare. There, the women of the order would examine her, not harshly, but thoroughly. Flesh, voice, posture, prayer, all were watched, judged not by sin but by silence. A girl who passed would be presented to the village with a silver ribbon in her hair. A girl who failed, well, there were no stories of those. They simply weren't spoken of. And Leora, with her strange, quiet and eclipse-born gaze, was next. Her date was marked, her name whispered, her time only 3 nights away. Leora moved through the village like a shadow wrapped in silk, present but never quite touched. She spoke when spoken to, smiled with the softness of someone who had learned long ago not to reveal too much. Her mother, Anwen, once known as the best herbalist in Eld Hollow, had trained her in silence. How to listen to what leaves don't say, how to understand the space between prayers. Their cottage sat near the edge of the woods, where the fog clung, longer in the mornings, and owls watched from crooked branches, as if guarding secrets too old for men to remember. No one visited often. Not because they feared her, but because Leora's presence made people aware of their own noise. And in a village where order depended on quiet obedience, a girl who wore silence as naturally as skin was unsettling. Even the order, robed and reverent, took notice. They didn't speak against her. That would be improper. But their eyes lingered longer during chapel, their nods slower when her name was mentioned. She had not misbehaved, but she had not belonged either. In the days leading up to the ceremony, the village shifted in subtle ways. Cloth was dyed white and hung to dry on door frames. Bells were polished. The old priestess, Mother Keth, sharpened her walking stick and cleaned the steps of the chapel herself, a sign that the ritual would be strict, by the book. Girls younger than Leora whispered as she passed, not with cruelty, but with the kind of fascination reserved for stories that might end in legend or warning. She noticed, but said nothing. Each morning she walked to the stream, washed her hands with wild mint, and looked at her reflection as if trying to memorize it. Not out of vanity, Leora had none, but perhaps to remember that she was still herself. Still here, still whole. And each night her mother lit a candle beside her bed, said no words, and kissed her forehead twice. Once for protection, once for remembrance, and still, no one knew she would vanish. The night before the final preparation, the air in Eld Hollow changed, not with storm or frost, but with a stillness too complete. Even the dogs stopped barking. The wind, which usually pressed gently against shutters and rooftops, seemed to pause in reverence or restraint. Inside the chapel, the order laid out the garments for the ritual, white linen folded thrice, scented with lavender and wax. A basin of rosewater was poured. Silver combs were polished. In the center of the altar, the ceremonial bowl, carved from stone, said to have come from the first wellspring, was placed with exact precision. Everything had meaning. Everything had a place. And tomorrow, that place would be filled by Leora. At her home, Anwen sat awake, hands clasped tightly in her lap, eyes unfocused. The candle she always lit beside her daughter's bed burned lower than usual, flickering as if in hesitation. She had not told Leora everything. Some truths, she believed, were too heavy for a 17-year-old heart. Others would never leave her lips. Leora herself stood outside, just beyond the back door, barefoot on the grass that had turned silver in the moonlight. She wore her cloak, but not for warmth. Her gaze was fixed on the forest, not the trees, but what breathed between them. The woods had always whispered to her, not with words, but with something deeper. A pull, a question, a rhythm that did not match the bells of the chapel. She had once dreamed of following it. Now, with the ritual a single sunrise away, she found herself listening harder than ever. Behind her, the village slept, trusting that tradition would unfold as it always had, that the girl would walk the path, lower her eyes, and return ribboned and silent. But Leora, still and breathing beneath the stars, felt something different. Not fear, not defiance, but the unmistakable awareness that her name did not belong in someone else's mouth, that her silence was not submission, that somewhere, even if she didn't know where yet, she was already walking away. And when dawn came, her bed would be empty. The morning of the ceremony began like all others. The bell tolled 5 slow times from the chapel. The sun crept lazily through a veil of mist, and the scent of baked barley bread wafted across the village square. But inside the healer's cottage, the stillness had changed. Anwen stood beside Leora's bed, the candle now nothing more than a puddle of cooled wax, her hand resting on a blanket that remained undisturbed. No imprint, no warmth, just the sharp, unmistakable emptiness of absence. At first, she didn't panic. Leora was a quiet girl after all. Maybe she had gone to the stream early. Maybe she needed air. But as the minutes passed and no footsteps returned, Anwen's fingers began to tighten around the edge of the bed frame. She checked the basket of herbs, untouched, the cloak hook bare. Her daughter's slippers were gone. Her name echoed too loudly in the room, and something ancient in Anwen's bones, something that had been waiting for years to be true, whispered, "She's not coming back." Word spread slowly, as it always did in Eld Hollow. A neighbor mentioned that the girl hadn't been seen at the well. A boy said he thought he saw her walking past the edge of the woods the night before, but none of it felt certain. None of it could be proven. The order was notified by a red-faced courier who stuttered as he explained that the maiden meant to be examined had vanished sometime in the night. Mother Keth listened in silence, then nodded without visible emotion. "Continue as planned," she said. "Set the table, light the candles." When asked what should be done if the girl did not arrive, she simply said, "She will," or her absence will speak louder than her presence ever could. No search was called, no alarm rang, only silence. And in the chapel, the white linens remained folded, the basins still untouched. The village gathered slowly, unsure whether they were attending a ceremony or a question. And as the chapel filled, one name was missing from every whispered greeting. And from every bench, the chapel had never felt so full and yet so hollow. Villagers filed in with the slow, awkward energy of people attending a ritual they no longer trusted. The scent of melted wax and rosewater clung to the stone walls like breath held too long. The silver combs remained untouched on the altar. The white ribbon, meant to be tied into the maiden's hair after her passage, hung limp over the edge of a carved stool. Children were hushed, but even their stillness seemed restless, as if they sensed that something unspoken was unraveling around them. Elders shifted in their seats, eyes scanning the doorway again and again. And though no one dared say it aloud, the thought bloomed in every mind. What does it mean when a girl chooses not to come? Not because she was late, not because she was taken, but because she left before being told she could. And when entered last. Her cloak was dark, her face unreadable. She took her place near the back, not among the other women, but apart, as though her role had changed in the night. Some glanced her way, expecting tears, apologies, explanations. She offered none. Her hands remained clasped, eyes fixed on the altar, not with grief, but with a depth that unsettled even the priestess. Mother Keth stood at the center of the ritual space, her voice steady, her expression disciplined. "Today," she began, "we were meant to witness a passage, a transformation." Her gaze swept the congregation. But what happens when the passage is refused? No one answered. The silence stretched, not empty, but charged. Keth continued. "This ceremony will not be rescheduled. The absence has spoken. Let it be remembered." She gestured, and the acolytes began to clear the items, their movements slow, uncertain, like dancers unsure of the music. Outside, the chapel bell rang once, a single, low note. Not a celebration, not a warning, just acknowledgement. The village would not say it openly, but something had shifted. A ritual had been broken, a girl had disappeared, and worse, she had chosen to. That afternoon, the village returned to its rhythm, at least on the surface. Children fetched water, men repaired fences, and women boiled roots for supper. But everything felt slower. Words came out softer. Footsteps paused more often at doorways. Even the birds seemed more cautious in their songs. Eld Hollow had no laws about vanishing, no punishment written for a girl who simply chose not to appear. But still, there were consequences. Not in courtrooms or cells, but in stares, in whispers, in the way people looked at one another and wondered if something sacred had been lost. Or worse, revealed as unnecessary. In a village built on repetition, where every year mirrored the last, Leora's absence was not just a missing person. It was a crack in the pattern. A question no one wanted to ask aloud. Anwen returned home to a house that felt too clean, too quiet. She left the bed untouched. She didn't light the candle that night. Instead, she opened the window and let the air move freely through the space, as if to welcome whatever Leora had found on the other side of tradition. She did not cry. Her grief, if it existed, was private and still. In her heart, she believed something few would understand. That the disappearance might have been a form of survival. Not all escapes happen in the dark. Some happen with the clarity of morning. And somewhere in the forest, beyond the edge of maps and memory, she imagined her daughter breathing freely for the first time. Not as a symbol, not as a ceremony, but simply as herself. And yet, the question lingered. Where had she gone? Not just the direction of her feet, but the direction of her soul. Had she planned this? Was there someone waiting for her? Or had the trees simply opened when she reached them? The villagers would never know. But from that day on, no maiden ever stood on the chapel steps with quite the same stillness, because now in every ritual there lived the echo of one who did not arrive, and the space she left behind could never be filled. Leora had left long before the sun rose. Her slippers, damp with dew, moved silently across the mossy edge of the forest, each step taken without hesitation. She did not run. She walked, steady, calm, as if following a path only she could see. The woods welcomed her not with fanfare, but with a quiet acceptance, as though it had always been waiting for her to arrive. She knew the outer trees well. Her mother had taught her where the healing roots grew, where mushrooms could be trusted, and where the owls gathered before the rain. But past that, beyond the woven thickets and stone markers, was another forest entirely. Deeper, wilder. There the light filtered in green, and the wind carried the scent of secrets. And it was there Leora went, not guided by fear, but by a need so deep it no longer had a name. As she moved deeper, the silence changed. It wasn't the hush of early morning or the pause of prayer. It was a silence that breathed with her, that stretched and bent around her like fabric. No birds called, no branches cracked, only her breath, and the steady beat of her own heart reminded her that she was real. She didn't look back. Not because she was certain, but because some things lose their power the moment you turn around. Her village had carved a shape for her, one made of linen, obedience, and invisible threads. But Leora had never truly fit into that shape. And now, with each step away from it, she felt lighter, though not yet free. Her body ached, not from pain, but from unspoken weight finally lifting. She carried nothing but a pouch of herbs and a single ribbon, the one that had been meant for her hair. She didn't wear it. She didn't need to. It was no longer a symbol of purity, but a reminder of what she had walked away from. She tied it gently to a tree branch as she passed, not as a signal, not as defiance, just to leave something behind. As midday approached, shafts of sunlight slipped through the high canopy, landing on patches of ferns and damp stone like soft lanterns guiding her forward. Leora moved with care, not from fear, but out of reverence for the land, for herself, and for the silence that now felt like a companion instead of a cage. The forest was not empty. It was full of things most people had forgotten how to hear: the stretch of bark under heat, the hush of mushrooms breaking the soil, the slow sigh of the earth settling. For the first time in her life, Leora felt no need to measure her steps, to fold her hands properly, or to make her voice smaller than it was. There was no one to watch her. And that, more than anything, felt like truth. Not freedom in the loud, wild sense of escape, but freedom as stillness, as breath uninterrupted. She paused beside a fallen log, kneeling to gather a handful of mint and softleaf. Plants she recognized, ones she had dried countless times under her mother's window, but now they belonged to her. No altar, no ritual, just usefulness and beauty. She tucked them into her pouch with care, then sat for a moment on the log, letting her legs rest and her mind settle. The ache in her feet was dull, but her heart beat steady. She had no map, no destination, but she wasn't lost because she wasn't trying to find a place. She was trying to find herself. The part that had never belonged to candlelight and chapel steps. The part that had only spoken in dreams and long glances toward the trees. She looked up and saw a crow on a high branch, watching her with one tilted eye, not startled, not hostile, just present. She nodded to it, unsure why, maybe just to say, "I see you too." And for a moment, she felt seen in return, not judged, not measured, just seen. And in a life where she had always been watched, the difference was everything. That evening, as the sky began to dim into a soft blue-grey, Leora found a hollow near the base of a wide-bellied tree. The kind that looked like it had been standing for centuries, maybe longer. Its roots curled over the earth like sleeping animals, forming a natural alcove where the air felt warmer, the wind gentler. She crouched down, pressing her palm to the base of the trunk, feeling the quiet pulse of life that ran through it. She didn't speak, not because she feared breaking the silence, but because there was nothing to say. The forest didn't ask questions. It didn't demand explanations or rituals or proof. It simply accepted presence. And that for Leora was sacred. She laid her pouch beside her, sat with her knees pulled to her chest, and rested her head against the bark. For the first time in days, maybe even years, she allowed herself to feel tired, not from resistance, but from arrival. The darkness came slowly, folding in like a thick blanket, stitched from mist and distance. She didn't light a fire. There was no need. The warmth from the tree, the soft sounds of crickets beginning their nightly hymn, and the steady beat of her own breath were enough. Above her, the leaves moved gently, revealing slivers of stars. She watched them blink into existence one by one, like tiny promises she didn't yet need to understand. She remembered stories told to children, that stars were the eyes of those who came before, watching from above. But tonight, they didn't feel like watchers. They felt like witnesses. Quiet, far, gentle. Leora closed her eyes, not to sleep just yet, but to rest inside the decision she had made, to feel it settle into her bones like warmth. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, or even if she'd stay in this forest beyond the next dawn. But for now, in that hollow beneath the ancient tree, she had something she had never been given freely: space. And in that space, she wasn't a maiden or a test. She was simply Leora. The morning light came slowly, filtering through the leaves in soft gold and silver threads. Leora woke before the sun had fully risen, her body still tucked beneath the curve of the ancient tree's roots, her breath steady. For a moment, she forgot where she was, not in fear, but in peace. There were no bells to wake her, no footsteps outside her door, no voice calling her name in expectation. Just the whisper of wind through the leaves and the sound of birds beginning their soft chorus overhead. She sat up slowly, stretching her arms with the kind of quiet freedom one only feels when the world doesn't know where you are. There was something sacred in that invisibility. She didn't belong to anyone, and for the first time in her life, she didn't need to. She drank from a nearby stream, cold and clear, then used a flat stone to comb her hair, not for beauty, for clarity. She bound it back with a strip of linen torn from the hem of her dress and whispered to her reflection in the water, "Today belongs to me." The words weren't meant for magic. They were a grounding, a promise, spoken softly to her own bones. As she stood and gathered her pouch, she noticed something across the stream, a trail. Not wide, not worn, but unmistakably there. The grass bent, small stones shifted, as if someone else had walked this way not long ago. Her heart quickened, not in fear, but in curiosity. She stepped across the water, feet careful, and followed the path through a thicket of ferns. The trail curved gently uphill, revealing a clearing that took her breath. It was neither village nor ruin, just space, open, soft and wild, with wildflowers scattered like forgotten offerings and trees spaced far enough to let in sky. In the center stood a single wooden post worn and carved with lines she couldn't read. It wasn't a warning. It felt like a welcome. And Leora, standing at the edge of this unnamed place, realized something deep within her had already arrived, before her feet ever did. She stepped into the clearing with quiet reverence, as if entering a sacred hall made not of stone, but of air and wildflower. The soil was soft beneath her feet, the scent of damp earth mingling with something faintly sweet. Honeysuckle or clover, maybe both. There was no structure here, no roof or hearth, and yet Leora felt the unmistakable warmth of belonging. The clearing didn't need walls to hold space for her. It simply let her be. She walked slowly to the wooden post in the center, fingertips grazing the carved symbols along its surface. They weren't letters she knew, not from scripture, not from the village, not even from the few ancient books her mother once kept hidden under floorboards, but they didn't frighten her. In fact, she found herself whispering to them, not with words, but with presence, like saying, "I don't know what you mean, but I'm listening." Beneath the post, half buried in soil and moss, she found a flat stone, smoothed by time and weather. She knelt and brushed it clean. Around the edges were similar markings, spirals, crescents, and soft intersecting lines that looked less like writing and more like memory. She smiled gently. It didn't matter what it said. It was here. Someone had stood in this place before her. Maybe not recently. Maybe not even in her lifetime. But someone had known this clearing, this quiet, this stillness. And now she did, too. Leora sat in the grass, legs folded, face turned to the sky. The wind moved slowly through the trees, brushing her shoulders like a shawl woven from breath. She took a deep inhale, let it settle, and felt herself shift. Not away from the girl she had been, but closer to the one she was becoming. She wasn't hiding, she wasn't lost. She was home, not in a house, not in a family name, but in the simple, unspoken truth that she could exist without needing to explain. The forest had given her that, and the clearing had offered its name without saying a word. That afternoon stretched like a gentle exhale, slow and forgiving. Leora remained in the clearing, letting the hours pass without measuring them. There was no bell to tell her when to eat, no candle to mark prayer, no window to show how much sunlight was left. The rhythm of her day came from the forest itself, the shifting of light, the rise and fall of birdsong, the way shadows began to gather near the roots of trees. She wandered the edge of the clearing, gathering berries and herbs she recognized. Elderflower, a patch of thyme, and something her mother used to call fox lace, good for calming the heart. She didn't gather much, only what she needed. The land wasn't hers to take from. It was hers to share space with. At one point, she found a circle of stones tucked near the tree line, half covered in moss and leaning as if they'd grown tired of standing. She cleared the leaves from inside it, not to perform a ritual. She had left those behind, but simply to sit there, to be still. As she did, a light breeze moved through the trees, making the tall grass lean toward her, as if the whole clearing had bent closer to listen. She closed her eyes and placed her hands on her knees, palms open. Not in prayer, in presence, in gratitude, not for being saved, but for saving herself. When the sun dipped low and painted the trees in amber and gold, Leora stood and stretched. Her body was sore in small ways, her legs from walking, her back from resting on the ground. But it was the kind of ache that came from being alive, not from being trapped. She looked once more at the wooden post and the symbols she couldn't name, then smiled. "Thank you," she whispered, not expecting an answer. And none came. Just the wind, soft and steady, brushing against her as if to say, "You're welcome. Stay as long as you need." And in her heart, Leora knew, she would. The days that followed moved gently, like silk through fingers. Leora woke with the sun, not because she had to, but because her body had learned to respond to light instead of orders. The clearing remained hers, though she never claimed it. She swept the leaves each morning, gathered herbs when needed, and built a small fire circle using the mossy stones she'd cleared days earlier. She made no great plans. She didn't carve a home into the earth. She simply lived. One breath, one meal, one night of stars at a time. And in that slow rhythm, something unexpected bloomed. Peace. It wasn't loud or triumphant. It didn't erase what she'd left behind. It just grew quietly, like wild mint. Unnoticed at first, until suddenly it filled everything. She spent her mornings tending to simple things. Heating water over the fire, drying herbs on flat bark, listening to the birds and learning their calls, noticing how certain ones returned at the same hour each day. Her mother had taught her the names of plants, but now Leora gave them names of her own. Names that made sense not by history, but by how they made her feel. She called one kind of flower breath leaf because it only opened when the wind moved. Another she named sleep shade because its scent made her eyelids heavy. Naming things was quiet power, not like the names the village gave, titles and roles and duties. These names came from relationship, from attention. She still didn't speak much, but when she did, it was to the trees or to the wind or sometimes to the stones. Not because she believed they would answer, but because it felt good to hear her own voice without measuring it. There was no one to nod in approval, no one to correct her tone, just the sound of herself, steady and present, woven into the breathing world. And in those simple days, marked not by ceremony but by sensation, Leora began to feel something she never thought she could, not just safe, but real. On the 7th morning since her arrival in the clearing, Leora noticed something different. It wasn't dramatic. No footprints, no voices, no scent of smoke. Just a change in the way the wind moved, a subtle shift, like a second presence breathing beside hers. She paused, crouching near the stream where she had gone to fetch water, and listened, No bird stopped singing, no branches cracked, but her skin prickled. Not with fear, but with awareness. She stood slowly, scanning the trees. Nothing moved. Nothing stared. Still, the feeling didn't leave her. That afternoon, she wandered farther than usual, following the edge of the forest slope where sunlight draped over thick ferns. She wasn't searching for danger. She was following curiosity, the same kind that had once drawn her toward stories told in whispers and now led her beyond the comfort of routine. Near a cluster of elder trees, she found something hanging from a low branch along a ribbon, not hers. Faded green, frayed at the edges, tied in a knot she didn't recognize. It fluttered lightly in the breeze, as if waving. Leora stepped closer. Her fingers brushed it. The fabric was soft, worn by time, and smelled faintly of smoke and lavender. Not fresh, but not forgotten. Her heart thudded slow and strong. Someone had been here. Perhaps recently. Perhaps not. But the forest wasn't only hers. She was not the first to leave a ribbon behind. That realization didn't frighten her. It steadied her. The forest, wide as it was, had held others too. Other girls, other choices, maybe even other ceremonies, never completed. Maybe even other names never spoken aloud again. She left the ribbon where it was and sat beneath the tree. She didn't call out. She didn't need to. If someone had meant to be found, they would have stayed. If not, she would honor that silence. Still, she whispered into the bark beside her, "I see you." And in that moment, she didn't feel alone. The forest had stories, not all of them hers, and that made it even more sacred. That evening, Leora returned to the clearing with the forest's quiet still clinging to her skin. She didn't feel watched. She felt witnessed, not by eyes, but by time itself. The fire she kindled burned steady, its warmth familiar now, like the low voice of someone who never rushes you. She boiled mint and elderflower into a soft tea and drank it slowly, letting the steam open her breath. The stars began to blink into place above her, one by one, and she greeted them like old companions. She had stopped counting the days. Not out of forgetfulness, but because numbers no longer anchored her life. Instead, she marked time in sensations, the day her legs stopped aching, the day she named a flower, the day she found the green ribbon. These were her new calendar. Personal, quiet, true. She sat near the fire with her legs tucked beneath her and began weaving small braids into lengths of dried grass. Not for a reason, just because her hands needed to move. She remembered how the village had once praised hands that stayed busy, but only if the work served someone else. This time, her fingers moved without duty. The braid was for no one, and in that simplicity, she smiled. The wind stirred gently through the trees. Somewhere far off, an owl called, and when she looked up, the clearing seemed to glow softly, as if the forest itself had leaned in closer to listen. Before sleeping, she walked to the edge of the clearing, placed one of the small braids on the base of the wooden post, and whispered, "Still here." It wasn't a statement of defiance. It was a message to whatever part of the world might be listening, to the silence that had once felt like a cage, and now felt like a home. Then she lay beneath her woven blanket, head resting against her folded cloak, and closed her eyes. Not to escape, not to hide, but to rest inside the life she had chosen, one soft, invisible thread at a time, On the morning the wind changed, Leora felt it before she opened her eyes. It wasn't colder, it wasn't faster, it was simply different, carrying with it a stillness that had weight, like the breath before a question is asked. She sat up slowly, rubbing her palms together, listening. The forest around her was awake in the same way it had been every day, birds moving in the trees, insects humming in the grass, leaves rustling softly. But beneath that there was something else. A quiet tension in the air, as if the world was waiting, not warning, not threatening, just waiting. She stood and stepped barefoot to the center of the clearing, lifting her face to the sky. The clouds moved slower today. The light filtered through them in long, golden strokes. She took a breath and whispered, not knowing why, "I hear you." She spent the morning walking, not in search of anything, but to be close to the trees. Every step felt more deliberate, more aware. She noticed small things she hadn't seen before. The way the moss curled around the base of certain trunks, the way certain mushrooms pointed in the same direction, the faint curve of animal paths crossing her own. She walked until she found herself at the edge of a ridge she hadn't yet reached, where the land dipped into a valley blanketed in mist. The view stretched far, farther than she imagined the forest went. And in the distance, she saw something she hadn't expected. Smoke. A single, thin column rising into the air. Not from a fire out of control, from a hearth. Someone was there. Her heart didn't race. It slowed. The realization settled in her like a smooth stone dropped in water. She wasn't alone out here, and she never had been. She crouched in the tall grass, watching the far-off wisp of smoke for several minutes. Then she turned away, quietly, and made her way back. Not because she was afraid, but because she wanted time to decide, was she ready to be seen again? Back in the clearing, the fire had gone cold, but the coals still held warmth. Leora sat near them, legs crossed, eyes tracing the edge of the wooden post in the fading light. The ribbon she had tied there days ago fluttered once in the breeze, catching her attention. She reached for it gently, running her fingers along the frayed ends, and wondered, not with fear, but with curiosity, what she would say if someone found her. Not someone from Eldhollow. She no longer feared that, but someone else. A traveler. A quiet presence like her. Someone who had also chosen to step away from a life too narrow. The thought stirred something in her. Not longing, but readiness. The silence that had protected her for so many days now felt like a door she might be willing to open. Slowly. Carefully. On her terms. She spent the afternoon preparing in small, deliberate ways. She gathered more herbs than usual, packed them tightly into woven cloth. She reinforced the edges of her shelter with extra branches, smoothed the place where she slept with fir needles. These weren't acts of fear. They were offerings, signs of steadiness, of welcome, not to anyone in particular, but to whatever might come. She didn't go back to the ridge, not yet. But in her mind, she held the image of that thin line of smoke like a note tucked into a pocket. She wasn't rushing toward it. She wasn't turning away. She was holding it, softly. As the day drifted toward evening, she lit her fire again. Not for warmth, but for visibility. The flames were small, but bright enough to be seen through trees. A silent message. There is someone here. Not hiding, not lost. Just living. She sat beside it, not watching the woods, but simply existing. The forest knew the wind had changed, and Leora, who had once vanished, was no longer invisible. She was choosing to be seen. When and how that would happen, she didn't know. But for the first time, she wasn't waiting. She was ready. That night, the clearing didn't feel empty, though no one came. Leora sat near the fire, her hands wrapped around a warm cup of tea made from mint and elderflower, the steam curling upward like threads of thought she chose not to chase. The stars appeared slowly, patient as always, but tonight she didn't greet them. She simply watched, letting their quiet presence rest above her. Somewhere beyond the trees, the wisp of smoke she had seen earlier still lived. Perhaps inside, another shelter, perhaps tended by hands not so different from her own. The idea no longer unsettled her. It comforted her. The forest was wide enough for more than one story to unfold at once. She pulled her cloak around her shoulders and lay down beside the fire, not in fear of what the night might bring, but in trust that whatever came, or didn't, would not steal from her what she had built. Her sleep that night was deep, but not dreamless. In her dreams, she heard footsteps, soft ones, not approaching with speed or threat, but pacing gently nearby, as if someone was circling the edges of her space, unsure whether to step inside. She didn't wake in fright. She woke calmly before the sun, with a strange sense of peace she couldn't explain. The fire had burned low, but hadn't died, and the braid she had placed on the post the day before was gone. Leora stood slowly, brushing the sleep from her eyes, and approached the post. At first, she thought the wind had taken it, but then she saw something else. In its place, tied gently around the same wood, was a new braid, not hers, different weave, fir needles threaded with thin grass, carefully made, carefully placed. She stared at it for a long time, heart quiet. No message, no signature, just acknowledgement. She smiled, not wide, not surprised, just soft. Then she whispered toward the trees, "So be it," and turned back toward her fire. No longer waiting, no longer wondering, just ready. The days that followed moved differently. Not faster, not slower, just shared. Leora didn't see the stranger, not fully, but she felt them. Their presence moved through the edges of her clearing like mist, never lingering long, never intruding, but always near. Each morning she found small traces, a pile of firewood left just beyond her shelter, a strip of dried bark tied around a branch in the shape of a spiral, a stone placed neatly at the foot of the wooden post, marked with a single carved line, not threatening, not asking, just being. She responded in kind, not by speaking, but by acknowledging. She left herbs where the wood had been. She tied her own braid of grass beside theirs. She scattered flower petals along the trail leading outward from her clearing, not to guide, but to invite. The space between them was a language neither had been taught, and yet both understood. She didn't feel watched, she felt witnessed. There was no urgency in their movements, no demand for recognition. Whoever they were, they carried the same quiet she had chosen for herself. That, above all, is what made her trust them. Trust didn't bloom loudly. It was a slow thing, like moss growing on stone, soft and steady, only visible when you step back and realize something has changed. And something had changed. For the first time since she left Eld Hollow, Leora began to wonder what it would feel like to sit beside someone again. Not to explain, not to be approved of, just to be beside. No questions, no judgment, just shared air. One evening, as the sky burned orange behind the trees, she left a bundle of dried mint and rosemary by the edge of the clearing. No note, no symbol, just the offering. Then she sat by the fire, not expectant, but open. She didn't listen for footsteps. She listened for the shift, that small change in the wind that says you are not alone. And when it came, she only smiled. Nothing needed to happen yet, but something already had. The first time she saw them, it was through the trees. A flicker of movement, a shift in the way the light caught against something human. They didn't approach. They stood still, half hidden behind the curve of an old pine, their figure cloaked, face unseen. Leora didn't rise. She didn't speak. She simply looked, her eyes calm, hands resting on her knees. The fire between them cracked softly, casting gentle light across her face. After a moment, the figure raised a hand, not in greeting, but in permission. A silent gesture that said, "I see you. I won't come closer unless invited." Leora blinked once, slow, then nodded. Not yes, not no, just, "I know you're there." The figure remained for only a few heartbeats longer, then stepped back into the shadows, vanishing without sound. Leora didn't follow. She didn't feel the need to. The presence hadn't disturbed her space. It had respected it. That night, as she sat beneath the stars, the braid still tied to the wooden post, she found herself thinking less about who the person was, and more about what they understood. Whoever they were, they knew how to move through the world gently. That kind of knowing didn't come from books or temples. It came from silence, from being broken and rebuilt by it. The next morning, a small package lay near the edge of her clearing, wrapped in cloth, tied with bark string. Inside, 3 items: a folded piece of parchment with a pressed flower inside it, a stone carved with a spiral matching the one left before, and a single line written in careful ink. No one ever needed to pass a test to be real. Leora's breath caught softly in her throat. She didn't cry, but something inside her softened further, a part of her that had still been holding breath. She held the parchment to her chest for a long while, then looked toward the trees. And without fear or doubt, she whispered, "Come when you're ready." They didn't come that day, or the next. But each morning after her quiet invitation, Leora found small signs near the edge of the clearing. Not messages, not gifts, just acknowledgements. A leaf folded in a pattern only practiced hands could make. A piece of fruit left carefully atop a smooth stone. A single feather balanced against the base of the wooden post. She answered in turn, a circle of wildflowers, a pouch of dried thyme, a piece of charcoal for marking. The exchange became its own kind of ritual, not the kind forced by robes and rules, but one born of trust, of slow understanding. Leora had never known courtship like this. Not romantic, not expectant, but deeply intimate in its quiet. It reminded her of how the forest itself had first welcomed her, without demand, simply by allowing her to remain. Whoever this person was, they had learned from the same language. She didn't imagine a future. She didn't name them in her mind. She only welcomed the presence. Each night, as she sat beside the fire, she left a second spot open, not prepared, not arranged, just available. Sometimes she'd speak to that empty space, softly, not to fill the silence, but to share it. "Today I found a new place near the ridge," she'd murmur. Or, "The elderflowers are blooming early this season." not expecting a reply, but knowing somehow that it would be heard. And then one evening they came. No sudden entrance, no footsteps breaking through. Just a figure stepping from the trees at dusk, slow, steady, respectful. They stopped at the edge of the firelight. Leora looked up from her seat, her hands resting in her lap, heart steady. She nodded once. The figure returned the gesture, then quietly sat. A few feet away, no closer. Nothing more, no names, no explanations. Just two souls beside a flame, letting the air between them speak for them both. The fire cracked, the wind settled, and, for the first time since she left everything behind, Leora was no longer alone. They didn't speak that first night. They didn't need to. The fire between them crackled gently, throwing soft shadows onto their faces, and the forest wrapped itself around the clearing like a blanket. The figure, neither young nor old, dressed plainly in earth-colored cloth, sat with a stillness that matched Leora's own. Their eyes met once, not for long, but with the quiet honesty of two people who recognized something familiar in each other. No questions, no introductions, just breath, just being. After a while, the figure stood, gave a small nod of farewell, and stepped back into the trees. Leora watched them go, heart unhurried. Something had begun, but it didn't rush to arrive. In the following days they returned. Not always at the same hour, not always with anything to give. Sometimes they just sat, at opposite sides of the fire, sharing warmth and silence. Other times they brought things, berries, a carved flute, a piece of cloth embroidered with patterns Leora had never seen. She offered herbs, bundles of dried flowers, and stories told in fragments. Their voices came slowly, like water trickling from thawed stone. Names weren't the first thing exchanged. Instead came small truths. I once built a house and left it behind. I never learned how to pray properly. I was told I was too quiet to be remembered. Leora didn't ask where they had come from. She didn't need to. What mattered was that they had come at all, and chosen to stay, even in the slow, uncertain rhythm of her world. She spoke more now, not because she felt obligated, but because she wanted to. Her words had space. Her thoughts had listeners. And every evening, when they sat by the fire, she began to feel something she once thought she had given up entirely: connection. Not the kind shaped by duty, but the kind that rises like smoke. Quiet, shifting, impossible to hold, but deeply, unmistakably real. As the days blended gently into one another, something new began to shape itself around them. Not a routine, but a shared rhythm. They gathered water together, sat beneath the same trees during the heat of afternoon, and sometimes wandered in different directions, only to return without needing to explain where they had gone. There was no claim between them, no ownership, no naming of what was happening. And that was what made it precious. It existed because it was allowed to. And in a world that had once tried to define Leora at every step, this space, where no definition was demanded, felt like a rare and sacred thing. They spoke in fragments. Some days, only a few words passed between them. On others, laughter came easily. Not loud, not disruptive, but honest and soft, like a bell rung at dusk. She told them about the fig tree that once grew behind the chapel in Eld Hollow, where she used to sit as a child and wonder what was beyond the wall. They shared a story about a mountain trail where they once followed a hawk for hours, believing it might be leading them somewhere important. They both laughed when it led them in. a perfect circle. Not all paths are about arrival, they said. Some are about remembering you can still move. Leora didn't know what would come next. She didn't need to. Her days were no longer ruled by ceremony or silence, but by presence. Some nights, she still woke before dawn, watched the stars fade, and whispered her own name just to feel it vibrate in the air. Not as a label, but as a song she was learning to sing in her own voice. And when she looked at the one sitting beside her, she saw not a savior, not a symbol, but a companion. Another soul who had stepped out of their own name into something freer. And together, without saying it, they had begun to write a story that no ritual could contain. The day she found the mirror-still pond beyond the northern ridge, Leora didn't call for the one who often walked beside her. She went alone. The pond was small, cradled by stone and shaded by willow branches that bent low as if offering shelter. She knelt by the water's edge and looked at her reflection. Not to see beauty, but to witness what had changed. Her eyes were the same, her face still soft with youth. But there was something different now, a steadiness, a gentleness that hadn't come from being untouched, but from choosing her own shape. She touched the surface of the water with one finger, ripples dancing.
Outward, and whispered, "I never needed to pass. I just needed to arrive."
The breeze answered only with silence, but that was enough. She took a small, polished stone from her pouch, one she had found on her first day in the clearing, and placed it gently at the edge of the pond. A quiet marker. Not a monument, just something to say, I was here. I left, and I lived. Then she stood and returned to the path where the forest greeted her without question, as it always had. That night, as the firelight flickered between her and her companion, she said softly, "I think I'm ready to give my name back to myself." They didn't ask what she meant. They only nodded, their hand resting near hers, not touching, but close enough to feel. And for the first time, Leora said her name aloud, not in submission, not in ritual, but as an offering to the trees, to the stars, to the story she now claimed as her own. In the morning, she woke not to bells, but to birdsong. No one waited for her. No one watched. And yet, everything knew she had arrived. The wind moved through the clearing like a breath well held and finally released. She smiled, stretched, and stepped forward into the quiet. Not to vanish again, but to be fully, gently, forever here.